Hello. Once again, I'm going to be talking about mass media and its power. Light, by the way, just in case you're wondering, is from a heater. Very cold here at the moment. Um, just a quick update from my previous video on the alt-right. That's been covered a bit today, and there has been some clashes outside that conference. Donald Trump has actually disavowed them at this stage, which I think is reassuring. I don't think the alt-right is progressive for America, and I don't mean progressive in the liberal left-wing sense. I just mean progressive as in the adjective sense. Um, so it is good that the president-elect has disavowed them. You know, the more I hear about Donald Trump, the more I think he's not an extremist, but he doesn't have a great deal of conviction. That's really my impression of Donald Trump at the moment. I'm not concerned about him as a president. But I do think he's shown that he's very insincere because he's been telling a lot of people throughout his campaign he's going to do a lot of things, and he's backtracking on appears to be most of them. Anyway, that's just a side point. Okay, so good journalists versus bad journalists. That is the title of this video. I chose that title because it is striking. Obviously, the situation is not that simple. Nothing in this world is as simple as the good guys versus the bad guys, but it does get attention, and I do want this subject. I do think this is an important subject to raise and discuss. You know, the more I think of the behavior of big media networks, the more I frankly feel disgusted because the level of bias is so deeply entrenched that it's institutionalized. That's It's hard to see it actually changing anytime soon because the willpower won't be there. It's a human factor. Just like dictators will very, very, very rarely change their ways. You know, the power of big media networks, power is an aphrodisiac. Why would people change that? So I'm somewhat pessimistic about the future of this. Um, I want to talk about individual journalists, though. You know, I can talk all night about how I think the big networks, all of them, are corrupt to some extent because of bias. So, for example, CNN has a blatant liberal bias, Fox News has a blatant conservative bias, the BBC has a blatant left wing bias, Sky News has a basic right wing bias, Russia Today has a blatant Russian government bias. The list goes on. The list goes on. Um, there's very, very few networks that can really claim to be totally innocent. Some, in my view, are better than others, but I'm not going to even name them to pitch them against one another because then people will just point out all the flaws of whatever network I name. So far, yeah, I'm not even going to do that because it would give the wrong traction. Um, I watch most of these networks because I have satellite television. That's somewhat useful because it gives me a scope to look at all these networks. And the bias is blatantly obvious. But what they do is they will have many reports that are neutral reports, and that kind of covers the the bias that is also there. So in other words, they will say let's give a situation. Let's say there was a big train crash in India a few days ago. Now that's the sort of report where it's not really a major political issue as such. It's just an event, a disaster. So most of the networks aren't going to digress much from that story. So whether it be CNN or Russia Today or Al Jazeera, they're all going to say broadly the same thing. Maybe slight differences on the death toll that they announce, but that sort of story isn't going to be particularly controversial. It's when political stories or reports connected to war come into play that's when things get really dicey. Say Syria, for example, you're going to hear different perspectives on the war in Syria depending on what network you're looking at. Um, I have to say, I have a little bit of a background in journalism. and I don't talk about it much because it is minor. I didn't graduate, but I did take a degree in journalism, and I got some modules from the course, and of course that gave me a bit of insight into the world of journalism. Um, I can't claim it was a major part of my life, but it was there, and I often wonder what my life route would have been had I went down that route. I'm not saying I regret it or I don't. You know, it was a dream. I wanted to be a frontline journalist. But perhaps with that, I always try to be open minded. It's like when I talk about politicians, I always try to say you can't generalize. There are good people involved in the world of politics who are in it for the right reasons. They see problems in society and they want to do something about it. Well, I believe it's the same with journalists. People need to remember that there are good journalists out there. There are journalists who face very difficult situations, whether it be frontline reporting from a war zone, which is obviously dangerous. But it isn't just war zones, it's also stressful situations. For example, they could be covering political turmoil in a country, such as the situation in Thailand. Not necessarily a war zone, but still tense, and they face situations where they can be facing harassment or imprisonment. China is another example. It's not a dangerous country as such, but it's not an easy country to report from. That's why I have a lot of respect for Reporters Without Borders. I believe as an organization they are very worthwhile, and I absolutely agree with the principle of it. I personally don't believe that sovereignty is an excuse to um, trample press freedom unless there is a blatant political initiative with what the press is doing. So, for instance, if you have journalists that are from a hostile foreign state and they are working blatantly for that government, that might be another issue. But when they're just trying to do their job and report a situation, that's different. But the point is, there are good journalists out there who take real risks, who work extremely hard, who often have to place their trust in people um, with shady backgrounds. It's almost like working as a spy, I guess. You know, the sort of I have a number of biographies of prominent British journalists, and the sort of experiences that they have had. It's astonishing, really is. Kate Adie, John Simpson, Jon Snow. These people really have been through it, and Jeremy Bowen's another one. And I have a lot of respect for them. I really do. Incidentally, Kate Adie is from my city, Sunderland. But there is this difference, I believe, between frontline journalists, or indeed journalists who might not necessarily be in dangerous situations, but they are in it for the right reason. That is, they want to report history. They see things happening in society. They want to record it. Journalists are history recorders, um, and they want to report that. They want to help people be aware of what is going on. And it isn't just about reporting big news stories, it's also about keeping people informed of all sorts of situations. I mean, local newspapers will cover events that are going on and so on. Journalism is a massive field, it covers so many different things. And because it is such an important field, because it has such an influence on people's lives, it is essential that people understand that there are good journalists out there. So I want to really emphasize that. But I also believe there are bad journalists. And what do I mean by that? Well, I, I think there are journalists out there who know full well that they're working for networks that have a bias. And in their heart and soul, they know that there is the bias there. And they know that they have a certain outlook that they need to kind of subscribe to. It's almost like when you join a political party, you kind of have to nail your colours to the mast, so to speak. You have to subscribe to the ideology of that party. Well, if a journalist joins CNN or Fox or the BBC, there is going to be certain principles they have to abide by, and these are principles that go beyond the standard codes of practice for journalists, i.e., protect your sources, um, try and find out all the information. The codes of conduct I'm talking about, those ones are worthwhile, but there's others that kind of get into the ethos or the ideology, frankly, of whatever network they join. So freelance reporters are perhaps among the most noble reporters because they really are truly independent. But the downside with freelance reporting is the number of people they reach is obviously limited. They might be able to, and they're never 100% freelance because they would still have articles in a national newspaper. So they'd have some sort of partnership with a national newspaper. So freelance journalists are never 100% independent from that point of view. Um, Someone like Robert Fisk is going to have his pieces in The Independent. The Independent says it's independent. It's not. It has a centre left outlook. So really, I don't believe in a utopian situation where journalists just report the news and that's it. I do believe that the human factor is always going to come into play. Um, Recently, I forget her name, but a prominent BBC journalist had a tense interview with Milo Yiannopoulos, and it was about the gender pay gap and issues of feminism. Well, clearly, she was bringing her own personal views into that interview because you could tell that she was worked up. Now, to be fair, Milo Yiannopoulos is very good at working people up. He knows how to get under people's skin, but um, I forget her name now, which is a little bit annoying. But um, I think that factor comes into it a lot because journalists, after all, are human beings. You can't expect a journalist not to have emotions. But when they're doing it in a news studio, that's quite different from, say, for example, you have a journalist who has witnessed a car bombing in Baghdad. Now, they have to be a robot not to have some emotional sort of reaction from that. In fact, frontline journalists often suffer from the same or similar post traumatic stress as soldiers do because they really do see some horrendous things. But studio journalists, I don't think they've got an excuse for letting their emotions come into it. Um, and that is one of the hardest things, taking out that human factor. But I really do believe, I think I recall this incident before, this situation where I confronted Xinhua, the Chinese state network, and I basically said what was on my mind. It was a communist mouthpiece, and I had a tense but polite back and forth with whoever it was administering their Facebook page. I mean, the irony wasn't lost that they have a Facebook page, and yet Facebook is blocked by the very party that that manages Xinhua, because in China there is zero free media. It's all directly controlled by the state. Xinhua is absolutely part of the Communist Party. So I put that point to them, and they actually basically conceded ground and said, oh, well, things are slowly changing. So whoever was at the other end, that for me was interesting because it made me think, well, okay, they're being defensive, they're defending the network, but they actually know I've got onto something. And deep down, they know it's the truth. So I think there's journalists in countries like China who are not bad people, but they really have no other choice in that particular field. I do believe there are journalists in China who want to tell the truth, who want to be as transparent as they can possibly be, but they really do have restrictions. I believe there were tensions in, I think it was in Guangzhou, where there were some local editors wanted to report on a big scandal, and the CCP tried to bully them into silence. It was either Guangzhou or Shenzhen. It was one of those southern cities, and it wasn't Hong Kong. It was in the mainland. So that was interesting. But all over the world, regardless of background, I think there are good journalists. But networks. It's this culture of having these big tycoons running networks. I think that is the problem. And I don't know what the alternative is at this point. But I do think they should be a lot more accountable. I think, for example, it basically, to be blunt about it, it infuriates me that CNN utterly ignores the criticism leveled at them. To me, that just shows astonishing arrogance. You know, if they even defended themselves and made excuses for it, I'd almost prefer that to this complete disregard. They just don't care. And then they actually turn around and complain that the media has a bad reputation, and yet they totally ignore the criticism that is leveled against them. I keep talking about CNN because for me, it has stood out more than most other Western networks in recent months. Um, so, what's the future of this? I think it would be difficult for any individual journalist to have the courage to stand up to their to the CEO, because that's essentially what they are of the big networks. Some journalists do. I mean, there's brave individuals like Abby Martin who famously resigned on air on Russia Today. I would have great respect for a CNN journalist if they turned around and said, I'm not going to report from this biased network anymore. Or if a Fox journalist done it, because they all have this, all of them. I think the BBC is probably better at having a channel that the public can respond to complain. So the BBC at least responds to criticism. Doesn't mean that they're any less biased, but at least they respond. With Fox and CNN, from what I can tell, well, Fox does to some extent because Bill O'Reilly sometimes responds to critique, but CNN just doesn't. And the thing is, it's not, I don't think these networks are evil. I don't think they're totally bad. I mean, CNN has the Freedom Project. That's a good thing. You know, it raises awareness of worthwhile causes. But this bias that I keep mentioning, it's not a small thing. I really do believe it's a threat to democracy because the power that the media has to influence people's minds is immense. Even if people don't realize it, you know, subconsciously, they'll say, oh, I don't vote depending on what the network tells me. But subconsciously, I think a lot of people do. And in the UK, that's very much the case with the gutter press. I wish that wasn't the case. And people wouldn't admit it. But I do believe there are millions of people in this country that are swayed by the headlines on the Sun. And that is very sad. And I have to admit, if I ever met a tabloid editor, I'm not sure if I could maintain myself to be polite. I really do think they're some of the lowest people in the world. I have utter contempt for them and what they do. I really think they're little better than gangsters. I mean, I made this analogy before. You have like the Al Capone figure. You have kind of the second tier level. Forget all the Cosa Nostra terms, but second tier level. Then you have street thugs. Well, in the world of tabloid journalism, you have the editor, you have the sort of mainstream hacks, then you have some of the lesser hacks, then you have the paparazzi. So I regard it as little better than a criminal enterprise. It's basically a legal criminal enterprise, and I detest them, to be quite honest. Now, people might say, well, the answer is just not to watch any of these networks, and then they say, oh, find out the news for yourself. But how do you do that? I mean, you can't just go to Syria and see what's happening, you know? So we have no choice but to rely on these networks to some extent. And the only thing I can suggest is that it's not a case that they just make outright lies. A substantial portion of what they report will be the truth and it will be based on information they've gathered. It's just that it's selective. So what I would say is don't totally disregard them as being outright liars, but understand that there is enormous power going on here. And with that bias, take into account that you're hearing one side. I think probably the best approach is to watch various networks if you can. I mean, during the night of the election, the US election, I literally switched from CNN to Fox all night, and some of the international networks, France 24, the BBC, Al Jazeera, partly because it was interesting just to see different perspectives, but also for that reason, because I did not want to be overtly influenced by one network or the other. I'm a smart guy, if I say so myself, but I'm not. Anyone can be influenced, and I didn't. So we'll leave it there. It will be very difficult for individual journalists to stand up to these networks and say that this is wrong. We're too biased. We need to get more neutral. I do think it's a responsibility of the public to put pressure on them by any legal means necessary. Write letters of complaint, bombard their Facebook pages with I don't mean abusive messages directed at individuals, but generic messages directed at the network. Because when they start to realize that there is resentment out there, they might decide to change their track. And that's it. I'll leave it there. Let me know your thoughts.